Okay, welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know, my name's Steve Cushion, along with Gad Herman and Kate Quinn. We're the conveners of the UCL Caribbean seminar series, of which this is the second in this year. We're very fortunate today to have Sheryllynne Haggerty to speak and to launch her new book, which I can prove exists because I have my own personal copy of it. Sheryllynne is an honorary research fellow at the Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation. Well, without further ado, if Sheryllynne speaks to introduce her book, then there'll be plenty of time for questions, comments, and so on when that's over. So, Sheryllynne, over to you.
Okay. Oops, sorry. Right. Do you still have the issue with the slides, Steve, or is it okay?
Yeah, no, it's as it was, but okay, I think people could see it perfectly well. There's a technical problem which we are currently blaming on Microsoft. So you'll see the slides in this fashion, but they'll be okay. Sheryllynne, carry on. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just putting my timer on. Okay. Well, a huge thanks to Steve, Kate, and Gad for inviting me to be able to present on my latest book, and thanks to all the people who've turned up, especially if you've had an end of a long day teaching or something. It's really nice of you to be here. I'm really proud to have been invited, and I'm really delighted to have an opportunity to celebrate this book after what for I think all of us has been quite a few difficult years. Anyway, I'd also like to thank the blind reviewers and everyone who read a chapter for me in the middle of the pandemic, which included Gad, which was very kind. Thank you very much. And many were really generous. And I have to say that one thing that gave me sort of hope in the human race was the generosity of all those people who read a chapter. And said it was a lot of love in a time of coronavirus. And the pun is intended because I'm a huge Gabriel Garcia Marquez fan. Okay, so I want to start with a story. So it's the first year of the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63. And on January 26, 1757, Anthony McLaren was huddled together with several other men at the Royal Standard Inn in Falmouth, Cornwall, which you can see here. And I have it on excellent authority that this pub is not only still going, but is great and does lovely food. So if you go there, please visit it. The 17-year-old mariner McLaren was from Kirkcudbright, Scotland, and all the other men were giving evidence to the local commissioners of the High Court of Admiralty about their experience on the Europa's journey across the Atlantic in the months before Christmas. Now, the role of these commissioners was the first in the process of claiming prizes, that is, ships taken in wartime, and they took evidence from the crew regarding recent voyages, cargoes, owners, the captures itself and the captors, and the personal lives of the examined. Now, in wartime, many ships were taken by enemy privateers, but what happened to the Europa was really rather unusual. It left Jamaica in early November 1756, and then it was travelling home, or to London. It's actually an Irish vessel, but it was travelling to London. And when it got here, McLaren said that on the 21st of December, around 8 o'clock in the morning, a vessel under French colours had sailed towards them, and about an hour later fired a gun at the Europa. Several Frenchmen then... Sorry.
Sheryllynne, can I interrupt you for one second? It's not moving on.
Oh, so really?
I can request remote control, I see. I'm going to do that. And you, if you agree, I might be able...
Oh, I'm sorry. Really, moving on.
No, you're... but it seems to have frozen, I'm afraid, for
Okay.
me as
I'm
well.
going to
Even though
go.
I am. Oh no, I've not. I'm down to the Europa now.
Okay.
Good.
Okay. Is
Okay,
that okay?
carry on and tell me when to move to the next screen.
Okay, right. If you didn't see the pub, just go back one very quickly, show everyone the pub in case you want to go and visit it. And then if you go to the next slide, Europa, that's great. Okay, yep. Thank you, Steve. Okay, so on the 21st of December 1756, the vessel had got about here, as I said, on its way to London. Oh God, now mine's gone funny.
Don't worry, we can.
That's okay, right?
We've got to the Europa.
Okay, brilliant. Sorry. Okay, so a vessel came up under French colours and fired a gun at Europa. Several Frenchmen then came on board and took away several of the crew. McLaren and several of the Frenchmen remained on the Europa and the vessels parted company. 2 days later, on the 23rd of December, the vessel had started obviously going south. It was actually go to Spain on its way to France. Another privateer came up to the Europa carrying French colours. However, on coming up alongside, the vessel lowered its French colours and raised its true English colours. The ruse worked, and the English vessel, which McLaren later discovered was the Defiance, Captain Dyer, took the Europa back into English hands. They in turn put several of the Frenchmen, now prisoners themselves, on board the Defiance, whilst an Englishman, Andrew Mitchison, came aboard the Europa as prize master, and the vessel was first sailed to Penzance and then on to Falmouth, where, as we've seen, they all gave evidence. Now, the ship and all its contents, including the bag of letters, which would have looked like the one on the right, this one's obviously going to Rotterdam, the one from the Europa hasn't survived, it would have looked like that. That ship and all the contents, all the cargo in it was taken as evidence by the High Court of Admiralty and taken to London, where they were used to see who would own the property, who would, if it was illegal prize, this sort of thing. And all these letters still sit in the National Archives in London in 2 boxes. Now, they're known as part of the prize papers, in which there are 60,000 letters or more in many, many different languages. But for the 7 Years' War, there is only one other English bag of letters from the Caribbean for the whole war, and that is much smaller than the Europas. So these letters are really rare because, of course, most of the letters are taken by the enemy. There are some in other archives around the world, but I haven't managed to get them to get there. But the Europa's letters do allow a micro history of Jamaica of sort of 1 year when the island of Jamaica was Britain's most prized jewel. So can you go to the next slide, please? Brilliant. Okay, it's moving me on as well. That's great. Okay. So I found these letters quite by accident when I was looking for some nice examples for another project that I was working on. And of course, I opened the box at the wrong end, and it took me about 2 hours or so to work out what they were. Now, there are various items in the whole collection from the Europa's letters that other people have used, including Trevor Bernard and Ken Morgan, who some of you will know. But I realised that they hadn't been used as a discrete source in themselves. I realised they were treasure trove, but I had no idea for what. So with lucky of not a new technology anymore, but luckily I just photographed everything and then tried to work out what I would do with them. And it took me at least 18 months before I thought, you know what, I'm just going to transcribe them all, which is what I did. I transcribed the letters, bills of exchange, bills of lading, other documents, the envelope size, and even marginalia. Now, this little here you can see is actually the claims and examinations. So this was actually all the things that were written down in the pub in January 1757. But all the letters look like this, are wrapped up in little bundles like this. Oh, go back, sorry.
Right, so it moved on. Yeah, carry on.
I don't know why. I hope In some respects, these letters come from what Marissa Fuentes calls, quote, the traditional archive. That is the majority of documents produced during the era of chattel slavery in the British Caribbean by colonial administrators, planters, white men and white women, and also governing bodies in the metropole. But in other ways, they are not. They are not from elites, mostly. There was a couple of elite mercantile letters, but mostly are not. They are not official letters or papers, nor are they from a discrete collection of letters and accounts of merchants and planters, so often used for histories of Jamaica. They are the letters like those, like enslaved people, who are often occluded from history, poorer men and women, white, black, and of dual heritage. Now, because the Europa left from Kingston, which is Jamaica's main port, about 84% of the letters were sent from that port, but many were also sent from Port Royal, Spanish Town, and other towns around the island. The Europa's letters therefore tell us not only about ordinary people, but about urban life in Jamaica, when the bulk of historiography sort of concentrates on the elite planters, the elite merchants, and enslaved people. Furthermore, a significant number of the letters are from Irish people, when at present it is the Scots in Jamaica about whom we know more than the English, at least. Indeed, the letters were also sent to a variety of places in the British Isles. 53% were going to London, not unsurprising as that's where it was going first, but about 14.5% were going to Bristol, about 12.5% were going to various places in Ireland, 17.5% were going to places such as Plymouth, Winchester, Norfolk, Chippenham, Taunton, Kirkby, Ashby-de-Zouch, etc. Only a couple of letters actually from Liverpool, which might sound surprising, but of course, September is not the height of sales of enslaved people in Jamaica and especially Kingston. So I think that's why. But just as the Legacies of British Slavery project has done for the early 19th century, the variety of addressees demonstrate the extent to which all areas of the British Isles were linked to slavery and the colonial project in the mid-18th century. Okay, so now we're on the right slide, I think. So, ordinary people. So, some of the letters, like that on the left, from Eubank Ogle, are short one-page items. Others, the occasional one from elite merchants or planters, were several pages of dense, tight script. In total, there are over 407 documents, dating from early September to early November 1756. Apart from the odd planter and merchant, they are written by attorneys, auctioneers, ship's captains, shopkeepers, rentiers, clerks, lawyers, artisans, merchant and Royal Navy, ordinary seamen, as well as the odd lieutenant, and even the occasional woman. They were husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, daughters and sons, lovers and friends. Some were born in Jamaica, some were permanent residents elsewhere, and some were just visiting sojourners. So it's quite interesting that Eubank Ogle, who arrived in summer 1756, wrote home to his mother on his arrival in Jamaica, actually in Kingston, but he didn't write to her about being in Kingston, Jamaica, slave society, or enslaved Africans. He wrote to her about the real surprise that he was going to be a wheelwright, which wasn't the original role he was supposed to be in. Equally, Anne Graham, whose letter is on the right, and you can see how neatly she writes here, adored her small child and wrote home and clearly realised that she spoilt what she called her loved little chicken, talking of herself as a mother hen. And I mention these two letters because they really disrupt what we think we know about Jamaica in the 18th century. So next slide, please, Steve. Thank you. So, as I said, I just transcribed everything and I was completely led by the letters themselves. I had no particular agenda here, although one agenda did become obvious that I didn't want to talk about the elite people, but most of the people were not from the elites anyway. But as I was transcribing the letters, several themes emerged. which became the substantive chapters of the book, and they are in bold neat. And what I'm now going to do is just give you a flavour of how the letter writers sort of told their stories, wrote about themselves, and how they sort of informed the chapters. So it's just a few case studies, really. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first chapter is making money and thinking about how people survived in Kingston, mostly, and Jamaica at this time. And Anne Morley was one of the few women who wrote letters that I found in the Europa's postbag. The widow of merchant Daniel Morley, who died in 1751, she dealt with London merchants directly, although she did import gender-appropriate goods such as textiles, shoes, gloves, and tea. But she was well entwined in Jamaica's international credit networks, using bills of exchange for payment and other sort of paper credit instruments. And one of these merchants that she paid with bills of exchange was a London merchant called Nathaniel Lloyd, who clearly thought her a capable woman. She rented out 2 properties on his behalf, obviously earned some commission on those, although I didn't find out how much that was. And one of them was a house in Duke Street in Kingston, and it would appear that she was having problem rented out the house. She reported that Mrs. Atkins was leaving in October and asked Lloyd to release her from paying the rent on this property and the other one, which I didn't find out where it was. By way of demonstrating that these properties were not easy to rent, and also sort of looking after her own reputation, Anne added that many other houses in Kingston were empty. Now, she did not state, but this was probably because there's a huge political rift in Jamaica at this time, which I will mention in a moment. And the courts had just been moved back from Kingston to Spanish Town, and many people were moving back to the original capital as well at this time. Now, Anne was also the enslaver of several women, but she does not mention their labour or their contribution to her household in her letters, even though when she died in 1706, worth £4,500, which is not to be sniffed at in those days, although it's far from what men might have left, and £260 of that were for enslaved people. So, you know, Anne, even though she was reasonably comfortable and well off, she still had to do various different things. She was importing goods, acting as a renter. She had enslaved people, which she probably rented out to earn income as well. But many women were poor, and one such was Sarah Jones, who was a widow with 3 small children, the youngest having born since she and her husband had arrived in 1753. She was pregnant with a 4th, and before he died, her husband had set himself up as a retailer, having brought a small cargo with him. But since he died, the creditors were banging on her door and trying to get payment, but he'd left several bad debts which she could not collect. She told the assembly that she was, quote, reduced to the lowest extremity without any friends, money, or other necessary means, adding that the family had never applied for, quote, any assistance from the public funds. She therefore sort of positing herself as a productive member of Jamaican society, and she also framed herself as a hard-working mother. But what's interesting is that a petition to the Jamaican House of Assembly was actually referred to the Committee for Poor White Families for consideration, and the very existence of this committee really highlights and suggests that there was indeed wide-scale poverty in Jamaica at this time. And Sarah was awarded £150 for the relief of herself and her children. Now, I don't expect you to feel, of course, sorry for these people. They're enslavers themselves and benefiting from a slave society. But it does highlight that not everyone made money easily, even from this wealthy slave society. Okay, so next slide, please. Thank you very much. So the next chapter is about war and politics in Jamaica. And this letter highlighted here was written by William Miller, who was the captain of the Black Prince, which is the slave trade vessel. And he had encountered various problems selling his human cargo, which he attributed at least partly to the political rift between the merchants and the planters that had been going on. Now, this had been going on since 1753. It started off with a thing about finances and tax paying and fraud, but it really became to be something else. It became very acrimonious between individuals, but it also grew into a big struggle for power between the planters in Spanish Town, who were mostly the House of Assembly, and the merchants in Kingston, many of the elite who served on the King's Council and were sort of allied with the governor. And indeed, in 1754, they elected that the Kingston faction had managed to take over the House of Assembly, and they had all voted to move all the court records, the courts themselves, and the governor's house to Kingston, which they did in 1755. And this was all going on and finally got resolved when Governor Knowles left in July 1753 and Henry Moore took over. So when these letters are being written, it's the problem is being resolved, but people are still writing about all the problems to do with them. And of course, the animosities still remain as well. And the historiography has often written about this big rift as this struggle between the two factions, but also between power in Jamaica and home in London by the government and who was really going to rule Jamaica. And indeed, furthermore, the literature on the 7 Years' War also concentrates on the war itself, mostly in Europe, which means the Caribbean dimension is not very often mentioned and certainly been understudied. But in his letter, Miller comments on the war more widely, and it's really clear that the political strife as well as the war caused real problems for ordinary people. So his letter talks about, for example, the problems of French privateers, which played havoc with trade, the real danger to human life from ships being taken by French privateers and the men on them, problems getting or working out letters of marque, which is sort of the licenses, if you like, proposing privateering. And also, William even commented on military strategy, and like many other people, he was only too aware that the English squadron at Jamaica was, quote, inferior to the French at Hispaniola. So most ordinary people, as did Miller, commented on the political strife with frustration and bemusement because they could not really understand why an internal political war was being fought when the French were thought ready to attack, and many of the lesser merchants' letters talking about this. But even those who supported the Kingston faction, you know, visiting merchants and visiting ship's captains such as William Miller, were affected by the friction because it disrupted trade as well as normal governance of the island. Unless the merchants could not get paid, people such as William Miller couldn't sell their human cargo because sometimes they might sell into a planter who had fallen out with his agent, the merchant in Kingston, for example. Lesser merchants did not have the capital in wartime to buy the goods taken on the prizes, let alone the vessels themselves. And ship's captains also, which had to contend with their crew jumping overboard to go privateering, as many as ordinary soldiers saw the war as an opportunity to earn a year's money in a month. But whilst the elite argued amongst themselves for power and control, as I say, ship's captains and lesser merchants looked on with belief. Next slide, please, Steve. And indeed, for the ordinary soldiers and sailors, it really was a deadly place to be. If you look here at the slide, we can see death rates per 1,000 were normally about 25 to 30 on the far right there with England. Even extremely unhealthy London in the mid-18th century, it's only 45 per 1,000. If you look at troops in Jamaica, it's nearly 2.5 times that, 102 per 1,000. And in Kingston itself, it's even higher. And most of the killers of whites, whether they were permanent residents or visiting, was due to malaria and yellow fever. And the war, therefore, had real consequences for soldiers and sailors. People such as George Farmer, who was serving on the Royal Navy flagship HMS Dreadnought, had survived 2 fevers himself when he wrote home, and had seen 100 of his fellow sailors die, which is about, I looked up the vessel's Dreadnought's about 425, so like a quarter of the people died on that vessel from fevers. Hadn't even got to war yet. Similarly, William Ford, who had lost half his shipmates to yellow fever, I just mentioned, so he had seen horrible death rates as well. So for sailors and soldiers, the war was only too real. Not only were their living conditions very basic, and one of the outcomes of all this friction was that taxes weren't getting paid or voted for, and there were loads of things in the barracks that needed fixing. So even the people who were living in the barracks were in bad conditions. So they really paid an extremely high price through morbidity and mortality for defending Britain's colonial jewel, and one wonders whether they thought the King's shilling was really worth it. Next slide, please. So, oh, can you go back one? Is that possible? Thank you very much. Okay, so the letter on the left is another one of the fewer letters that women wrote. Only about 7.5% of the letters, and only about 5% were written to letters. But their letters are, really, really informing. So Sarah Folks on the left wrote in this letter to her young son, detailing an advice on how to use the postal system because she hadn't had a letter from him. Worried that her son was afraid of the cost, she advised him that he could, quote, carry it to the General Post Office in Lombard Street to go buy the packet. A single letter is 1 shilling 6 pence. That's about £8 or £9 now. But if you put it in any of the bags at the Jamaica coffee house, it will cost you 1 penny. Only the packets are safer. And I think it's really important just to point out that in this letter and many others, just how aware and good at using the postal system ordinary people were. But Sarah also wrote about how she was withholding presents and clothes because she hadn't written as some form of admonition. However, also in the letter bag is her husband's letter. And he writes much more straightforwardly to a different correspondent, obviously not to his son, to someone who's supposed to be looking after his son, and in which he straightforwardly asks if his son is alive. Is he dead, he says. And it appears that perhaps Sarah couldn't face the possibility of her son's death. She's sort of hiding it behind this. He hasn't written because he's scared of, paying or something. But read side by side, these two letters are really poignant. So William Ford, who I just mentioned, his letter is here. He was a Royal Naval sailor. I couldn't identify which ship he was on. But he mentioned that he'd lost, as I said, half his shipmates to fever. But he's also right home distraught about the loss of his wife. Now, he wrote to his cousin Alice, who was looking after his son in Plymouth, England, and it also appeared that his wife had died under her care. How devastating it must have been for him to have received this news on top of all the death and suffering surrounding him. And like many others who wrote home, he seems to have genuinely loved his wife, writing, which I love so well, and I did think she did love me as well. And so I think it was hard to part, which has put me in a sickness since I received your first letter. Now, many permanent residents in Jamaica were truly attached to their partners and children, as I just hinted at, even if they were temporarily separated by the Atlantic. As we saw at the start, Anne Graham's little chicken was clearly loved and extremely spoilt by her mother. And elsewhere in the letter, she writes about how the thought of sending her little girl to England for her education was a really stressful prospect for her. In Jamaica, loving families existed amongst the tyranny of plantation patriarchy, and great indifference sat alongside great indulgence. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, John Crow was a commission merchant living in Kingston with his wife. I think there was also a sister there, although they didn't have any children. And so this is my, so I should have said this is my very cheerily titled chapter, Death, Disease and Decay. He also had gout. Now, Crow had arrived a couple of years ago and clearly had no intention of staying in Jamaica in the long term. So his sojourners have no doubt shaped his perspective on death and disease in his temporary home, but his ideas were also clearly shaped by his being in Jamaica and a product of everything around him. So, you know, can read this quote. So I should think if I was superstitious that your John Wagstaff has put his mouth on me for true. In his letter where he wishes I may have gout for 6 months and not be able to sleep for 2 weeks. But I assure you tomorrow it will be 3 weeks since I was taken and am now only just able to come to the counting house. Now, apparently, in the letter, Wagstaff had cursed John Crow for not writing and informing him of some event. Now, these men all knew each other, and were friends as well as business correspondents. But I think this speaks to many of the ideas that many people talked about surrounding death and disease prevalent in Jamaica at this time. So in one way, it highlights the gallows humour argued to be so prevalent in Jamaica at this time. And this was part of a sort of psychological coping mechanism for dealing with the high morbidity and mortality on the island, especially for new arrivals such as John Crow. So people like him, 50% of all deaths happened in this rainy season, September, October, early November, and 78 or something like that % of those deaths would be people that had recently arrived, such as John Crow, but also, as we've seen, the soldiers and sailors as well. And of course, Jamaica was at the far high end of exposure to epidemiological regimes in the first British Empire, and people knew this. They know, apart from writing, which they know they're supposed to about their health, they often talk about seasoning. So I've got seasoned, there's a lot of quotes like that. So people are aware of it. But I think Crow's flippant remarks about his gout probably hid some really deep-seated, if unacknowledged, fears about his serious life chances. And there are other personal associations around gout that linked it with slavery and racialist ideas. So, for example, put his mouth on me for true, is sort of thinking about a curse. And I think this comes from ideas that are sort of misunderstanding of African culture, about a beer and mileism. And this was not illegal before Taki's revolt. And after this happened, a lot of it was thought to be caused by sort of obeah men who had encouraged it, etc. But before then, it was sort of seen sometimes sort of hocus tricks David Brown writes about and things like that. It wasn't really taken too seriously. So Crow could sort of joke about it in this way. There are all other another things that linked with being white, gout, incorrectly, of course, linked with drinking to excess and eating too much and civility and privilege. So gout was sort of like a white devil, whereas fever, yaws and leprosy were black devil links with enslaved people. So Crow was therefore claiming his own whiteness as well as status, because gout was linked to having enough money to be a glutton. It was also thought to be a man's disease as well. So even, next slide, please. Even Jamaica's deadly disease environment was not a complete leveller. While 6 sailors died in 5 or 6 days from yellow fever or drunk themselves to death in taverns, the rich could go to the baths, the hot springs at Bath here, Jamaica, to have their humours balanced, if not cured. And amongst Kingston merchants, there was certainly a callous disregard, not only for their black human cargo, but also for their fellow whites. However, at the same time, all this death and disease left some feeling at the very least disillusioned, and some, which I haven't had time to go into here, really were genuinely distressed and depressed about all the death and disease around them. So next slide, please. Okay, I'm aware I'm a little bit behind. I don't know how much of that is because of the tech, but I'll try and speed up a little bit. Okay, so The last chapter that's completely based on the letters, really, with some supporting evidence, is cotton candles and pages on consumption. Now, ironically, one imported food item was refined sugar. And Mary Rose, who's mixed heritage, former enslaved person, we think, not totally sure, but she had definitely been in a long-term, if unequal, sexual relationship with elite planter and politician Rose Fuller. Now, Rose Fuller went back to England in late 1755, so she's writing to him and keeping up as correspondence with him. And amongst other items, she asked him to send her loaf sugar, which of course was refined in England and then re-imported to Jamaica. And this also happens with butter, beef, alcohol, that there was a clear hierarchy of sugar as well as these other items that was available to accommodate all socioeconomic levels. So, for example, small-time merchant Mark Elliott ordered some single refined sugar, 16 to 18 pence a loaf, and then this went right up to double refined at 2 shillings and 3 pence, right up to triple refined, the highest quality sugar. Now, clearly, for those importing sugar, taste, you know, it was sweet, but it also said something about their taste, their consumption patterns, their wealth, because in Britain, you know, sugar had become a necessity that shaped dietary patterns, but the consumption of sugar in Jamaica said as much about race as it did about culture. White sugar was for whites and for elite people of colour, such as Mary Rose. Muscovado or brown sugar was for brown and black people. So sugar sweetened tea, like refined sugar, was also a product of global trade and mercantilism, but it was also a self-fashioning of freedom and whiteness. And I'll just quickly mention this picture. So if you got your fashionable or your fashion sense wrong, it was really important. People knew about the right colour of silk, and if you couldn't afford silk, you know, for a dress, maybe you bought a silk ribbon. You had to have the right shoes, etc., etc. And so Mary Ricketts, she wrote home. She was the daughter of an elite planter, and she wrote home in a scathing letter about a Miss Bowles, who I think might be the daughter of a lower merchant, lesser merchant from Kingston, but I can't prove it, of whom she noted, quote, "The comment was not as glorious as she had in her mind." And just to add to Miss Bowles's ignominy, she drew this picture in the letter in her toga costume for the delight of a correspondent at home. Now, far from simply aping the metropole or indeed the Jamaican elite, ordinary Jamaicans fashion their own identities according to their own requirements. And I think consumerism is the one area where perhaps they come together in a more similar manner than elsewhere, but it's still completely controlled by their socioeconomic means. But being able to buy some white sugar, however refined, and white soap, mark them out as white, or at least in Mary Rose's face as free. Okay, the next slide, please. Now, most of the letters, of course, don't mention enslaved people, even though they're everywhere around them. And so I didn't feel that I could write a book about Jamaica in 1756 and not mention them. And this meant two things. One, putting them in a chapter of their own so their voices didn't get lost in the other chapters. It also meant I had to use some different sources, and I'll mention some more of those in a minute. But in my travels around the archives in Britain, I found 5 letters, 2 from a formerly enslaved people, and 3 letters, sorry, from 2 different still enslaved people. So, and these are obviously rare, and they give us an opportunity to hear the voice of enslaved people without it being mediated by an enslaved, by a white person. So on the left, we have a letter from Joe Pete, who in 1756 lived on his with his wife on one of Rose Fuller's pens, which is a small farm, and he was in a relationship with an enslaved woman called Lucia. However, in 1758, Joe wrote to Fuller asking him to grant him a small piece of land on his land by the river in order to build a house where he could support his wife and his children. And in this letter, he really presents himself as a sort of industrious, hardworking citizen who could afford to build a commodious house for his wife and children. On the right, we have a letter from Grange Will, an enslaved black man who had been enslaved by Rose Fuller, and he seemed to be based in Spanish Town. So as I mentioned before, Rose Fuller's gone home in 1755, so both these men are writing to him. And it would seem that Fuller, in front of several of his important associates and friends, Mr. Stratton, Mr. Smith and Mr. Lee, had said that nobody should serve, that Will should serve nobody after him, meaning Rose Fuller. And so in this letter, Will writes to him, asking to confirm his freedom. But Will was to be bitterly disappointed, as Fuller received another letter written from him in 1758, in which Will reminded me of your generous promise to me, as I know you're a man of your word. Now, both Joe and Will wrote in very deferential language. They knew how to flatter Rose Fuller, but each of their two letters are written in different hands. They obviously didn't write them themselves. So someone must have written them for them. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to go through this one slightly more quickly as I'm running out of a bit of time. So I used lots of different sources to try and tell the stories of the enslaved people. These included accounts of produce, manumission records, or even mentioned occasionally in state papers, but they are mentioned in a few of the letters. And in one of them that I'm going to speak about here, there is also attached an inventory of enslaved people, which you can see here. And this is for the Mesopotamia state, which has been written about quite a lot, but this is a bit earlier. And I was able to, looking at how the values that were assigned to these enslaved Africans by whites, to sort of work out who were field hands, and in the first gang, and who were really valued, perhaps skilled tradesmen as well. And one of these included Clarissa, who I will talk about in a minute, who was the first field hand. But many of them showed signs of, hard days spent feeding the sugarcane. Sylvia and Tamar had both each lost one hand, and poor Leah and Margarita, here the first two arrows, had both lost both hands and probably were looking after the children. Down here we can see Rose, who was noted as superannuated, so she was either too old or too ill to work at all, and was assigned, the same as the others, no value, which is the way the whites thought of them at this time. Now, I mentioned about Clarissa. I want to mention her very briefly, because what's important in the letter that covered this slave inventory, John Kinloch is writing home to the new owner of the estate, and he writes about Clarissa and Tom, who was a man boy but middling to his qualities, but notes that he and Clarissa should choose not to be separated, there being some sort of relationship between them. Now, maybe Tom was Clarissa's child, but I think it's just as likely that he was an adoptive son, a part of a fictive kin network, which were coping strategies brought over from Africa. And Clarissa was clearly a strong woman. She was in the first gang for some time. She was clearly working there in 1756 and was still alive, as I found in later inventories from this for this plantation. She may well have lived into her 30s. So for enslaved people, the start of the war meant yet another year with not enough food, possibly starvation, more backbreaking work, yet more separation, another issue of Penistone blue, sort of rough hempen fabric, and for women, yet more rape. Their already terrible conditions were made worse by drought at the beginning of the year, heavy rains at the end, and increased prices of provisions due to the war. Their precarious lives were made even more so. One hopes that they found some solace in their family and friends, in their small possessions and in their African survivals, but it must have been cold comfort. When Essie Udugian's protagonist, Washington Black, surveyed the Barbadian slavery landscape, he noted that it was, quote, littered with broken teeth. The Jamaican landscape was littered not only with broken teeth, but with severed hands, burned and mutilated flesh, and broken hearts. Okay, can we go on perhaps 2 slides on this? One of my slides out, so I finished nearly on time. Thank you. Go to the next one, please, sorry. So the Europa's letters, I think, are a fantastic corpus, and they've let me sort of tell a story of a sort of cis-Atlantic micro-history of one island in 1 year. And, you know, it's important because obviously this is an important turning point. So after the 7 Years' War, Jamaica, and especially Jamaican elite, become even more powerful vis-a-vis London. And also in 1760, Taki's revolt really changes race relations in Jamaica, and all the laws and all the racialism gets even worse than it was before. But the letters give a sort of insight into thoughts and behaviours of everyday, free, ordinary Jamaicans, white and sometimes of colour. And they come to life through issues that often seem to us quite modern: concerns over money, family squabbles, petty jealousies, spoilt children, poor mental health, and a desire to purchase fashionable consumer goods. This is not to detract from the fact that Jamaica was a violent, cruel and bloody materialistic place dominated by slavery, from which all free people, not only white people, benefited. It undoubtedly was, but not everyone experienced it in the same way. Letters such as those from Eubank Ogle and Anne Graham describe a life that was far removed from those of the elite planters and merchants about whom we know most. They provide an extremely rare insight into the quotidian experiences of ordinary people in Jamaica at this pivotal time in history. In sharp contrast to the positive view of elite men such as Edward Long or William Beckford, the letters provide a human face, a social and cultural history of what it was like to be an ordinary person in the British Empire at an extraordinary time. And they also show that not everyone subscribed to the dominant mores of Jamaica's narrowly conceived commercial culture and calculated callousness. Instead, ordinary people offers a portrayal as of Jamaica as a heterogeneous and fractured society divided not only by race, but by socioeconomics. Thank you. I'm sorry I went over a little bit. If you want to put up the next slide, thank you. There's a discount there. If I haven't put anyone off from buying or reading the book, at least you get it a bit cheaper. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. That was excellent, and much appreciated. And we can put the code in the chat so that anyone who wishes to buy it can get the necessary discount. Okay, while we're thinking about some of the things that Sheryllynne discussed here, I was personally really struck by the when you say the affection that people had for distant family and friends, with no apparent thought for the fact that the enslaved Africans had probably left family and friends behind back in Africa. But what I was really wondering how you dealt with the fact that, as you say, the letters don't mention slavery. Now, that's hardly surprising. I mean, in a most extreme example, I'm sure SS officers in concentration camps didn't write home and tell their mothers what they were doing. But how do you, while you're reading them, deal with the fact that these are letters home that are not necessarily reflecting either the social values or indeed the actual truth of what was occurring to the people that you're writing about? Yeah,
it's really, as you say, it wasn't surprising, perhaps to those of us that, study the Caribbean, that, they don't mention it. And that's why, I mean, some people say to me, well, how can you call these ordinary people? But, they were ordinary people at this time. To them, it was a normal experience. It was what was all around them. They do mention, the death perhaps more than they do anything else, but without realising how many of their enslaved labourers died around them as well. You know, that doesn't really get mentioned. In terms of dealing with it, I say I wasn't surprised as such, but it really does, it comes to the fore more when you start mixing the different sources. So Anne Morley, of course, as I mentioned her letter, she doesn't say anything about them. But I found, you know, thanks to Trevor Bernard, I don't know if he's on the call, but he gave me access to all his databases, and I could, you know, look up people's probate inventories. And, you know, nearly all of them, except some of these very, very poor women, owned enslaved people. And so in terms of not me dealing with it emotionally, but how I dealt with it in the book, was to sort of use the other sources. Sometimes I had wills when people were bequeathing enslaved people. I also found, although I didn't manage to match up too many of them, but the manumission records as well, because then I also had, so in the Tales of the Enslaved chapter, for example, there's loads of quite people that look like they're relatively not well off, manumitting people, usually for either a small fee and sometimes for a quite large fee, that usually the enslaved person has managed to squirrel enough money somehow by hook or by crook to manumit themselves. And so it's through using these other sources to one extent that allowed me to flesh out these stories from the letters and say something true. And, you know, I mean, even with Sarah Folks there, you know, he's quite wealthy, although he doesn't come up in any of the literature I found. He obviously didn't leave any accounts or anything, you know. I've just got his couple of letters. I did find his will, and he leaves a lot of money to his wife and his children and everything, and some enslaved people, which he doesn't mention. So obviously, same with Anne Morley, these women were in these enslaved people around them in the house, even in an urban environment. You know, they're the washer-uppers, they're the, you know, bringing them tea, and they're just there. So one way was through, about the white people at least, who are using other sources. And another was trying to give some context where I could to the lives that they would have lived. So, you know, just added and comment that, you know, while they're down, you know, he's gone to the counting house. Well, yes, he would, but, you know, on his way there, what he would have seen, even though he doesn't talk about it. So, you know, and I suppose, I'm not sure if I've mentioned it already, but that's why I did feel that I needed this other chapter in order to deal with that in a third way as well. Cheers. I hope that answers it okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Gad?
Yeah, Sheryllynne, thanks very much. Predictably very interesting, of course. We talked about this before. But we didn't talk about one thing you started at the outset and you just mentioned again, which struck me as fascinating, which is Anne Morley. So here's a woman you describe as a poor woman, an enslaver, who gets help from the Jamaican House of Assembly. But when we think about, and you described her as a poor white, when we think about the comparison, say, to Barbados and poor whites, we don't assume necessarily that they were enslavers, and yet she clearly was. So this seems slightly odd that she was able to get help despite the fact of her being
Oh, yeah. So I think we've got confused between Anne Morley and Sarah Jones. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. So Anne Morley was the lady who had 4 enslaved people when she died, and was doing that. So it was Sarah Jones who was the one who had come with her husband who had died, and this. Yeah. So but I think it's important because I couldn't find. I don't remember. I don't think I found her. Probate. She wasn't, you know, either she'd gone back home. I couldn't find her probate inventory to see if she, as far as I remember. But yeah, so the other lady was, I think what was interesting about Anne Morley is she's obviously an importer, but she's doing, you know, she's acting as a rentier and doing other things in order to make lots of money, like we've seen in Britain at that time as well, sort of thing. But Sarah Jones's story, there is one that's linked with Sarah Jones, so she does get some money, right? But there's another guy, William Turton, who starts off as an auctioneer, and he comes and he tries to set up business. Now, what's interesting is that he does get the little bit of land that and some help from the Jamaican Assembly when he first gets there, which all poorer people can get. But what's interesting about him, he does get the land, but he applies to the Assembly in order to get title to the land which he hasn't got it, and so he can't sell it. Now, what's really important from there is that actually he doesn't mention how many, that he also has enslaved people, right? So what's really interesting for me about that is, of course, he can't use the land without enslaved people. So he has to try and sell the land and perhaps become a rentier of enslaved people to earn money from hiring them out. So even some people yes, he wasn't asking for relief in terms of monetary terms, but he was looking for help in order to improve his financial situation, but not in the same way as Sarah Jones was.
Okay, I may come back to you, but I'll let Kate get on.
I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, that's fine. Thanks. That's fine.
Kate.
Thanks, Sheryllynne. That was really fascinating. I had a couple of questions. One was, you mentioned at the beginning that a significant number of letters were from Irish people, and I wondered if you could expand on that and what you find that said about their varied position within Jamaican society at this time. And then also, given that you've done all this labor of transcribing all of the letters, whether there's any move for you or the archive to make those transcriptions or digitized versions of the letters publicly available. Thank you.
Thank you. So like I said, there was from Irish people, some around the island. A lot of them were, unsurprisingly, sailors as well, but some of them were from different places around the island, and they wrote to Dublin, to Cork, to Belfast. They're writing to them, obviously, from there as well. They don't comment, so we know, don't we, that Irish people often looked down upon and often had to, in the early days, carry tickets, the same as enslaved people did, and felt, in order to move around the island, felt quite sorry for themselves. They don't mention it much in these letters. Most, their letters home, and unfortunately, because they are quite poor, I can't always. I found wills of some of them, but not many of them, of the Irish people, actually. So I can't say too much about the thing about in Ireland. They don't reflect on that, even though we know they were often looked down upon, etc., etc. But they were a part of various different types of vessels. So quite a few of them, the letters that came from ordinary or able seamen, Royal Navy seamen, were Irish, but also they were on all new trade vessels as well. And there was quite a mix. So the Europa's crew, which actually the owner was Irish from Dublin, it originally sailed from Dublin, but I think only 3 of them were Irish. There was some Scotch, as they said, some Welsh, as they said, and a couple of English. So a lot of the crews were mixed. So they were obviously used for trade vessels and in the Royal Navy, no problem as well. What I did find interesting about the letters is especially people that didn't come from the big towns, and then the Irish people as well, is they're often written in dialect. They're written phonetically. And so one guy wrote back and said, oh, so I can't remember how many words, but if you read it out aloud, you can hear it. Died in 5 days sickness, like died in 5 days sickness. If you read it out loud, you're like, okay, a lot of phonetic as well. But the Irish people, like writers, like all the others, even the very poor people, knew how to write. I don't know if anyone's seen this fantastic book by Stephen King, Writing the Lives of the English Poor, which I luckily read before and really helped me. So these people are genuinely writing most of their own letters, and then they all know how to write proper letters. They know that they're supposed to, you know, for example, talk about their health, then ask about other people's health, then say about their journey, and at the end they know how to do a proper salutation and to finish, sorry, the letter, and to be reminded to everyone. Say, remind me to blah blah blah, and give my love to, and all that. So in terms of the letters, they write just as well and just the same sort of things. It was just, I thought it was interesting because, you know, there's you know, Aaron Carris's work and others, we know there's lots of Scots there, but we don't always think in the by the mid-18th century, are there still lots of Irish people? So I'd say quite a lot of them are sojourners as well, or they're not done. But they are writing. In terms of the archive, well, of course, there is the big digitisation programme of the prize papers. If people know about that, which is, I can try and send that to you. I should have put that out. I can't remember what it's called, but if you're at prize papers and the National Archives, it comes up. Ironically, it's funded by the German government to do all our things, but they're going to be digitising everything. I did talk to them. I think when they get round to doing these letters, they're not there yet. They're still on the sort of the earlier 18th century and different wars at the moment. But I you know, maybe I will, but we'll see. But I have got them in it. But they still need some, they need some tidying up, so it would require some funding. I couldn't just post them, as it were, as they are, even though I did my best to transcribe them, you know, not translate them. So, sorry, that was very long-winded. You know.
Amazing work.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Has there anyone else got any questions, comments that they want to make? Well, that gives me.
If I put everyone off, or
no. It's as quite often happens. I mean, most of us are completely overwhelmed by what you've done, and it's a bit difficult. I see Gad wants to come back.
Well, I would, of course, happily if somebody else asks. But I was also struck, Sheryllynne, by at the end of your presentation. I can't remember it was a Joe Pete or the enslaved people whom you described as enslaved. The one who wanted land, and I wondered about him, because perhaps I misunderstood if he had been enslaved and was now a free person of color, and what the relationship was to his request as being a free person of color, which of course interests me anyway. Yeah,
of course. I can't prove it, but he says that he was living there with his wife at one point. So I presume somehow he's got himself free. He was living on Rose Fuller's estate in 1756 with his wife, as he calls her, Lucia, and Lucia is still enslaved. So Lucia is still on the land and the children. Okay, so you know, I presume he wanted to do well enough in order to buy them free. Perhaps he's not allowed to. They don't always let them, do they? Buy themselves free, you know. Not very sad. I found out that all the ones who were manumitted were usually old and older, and perhaps were perceived as a drain on the planters or the owner, the enslavers' resources, rather than, so, you know, if Lucia's still young, perhaps she's the first hand and no one's going to let her go anywhere. So what he does is he writes to will and asks for land, rocky land. You know, he knows they're not going to give him good land. Give me some of the rocky land by the river on your pen. So, and he's obviously going to have to build it himself, the house, somehow. And then he's hoping that Lucia and his children can live there with him. And he even mentions in the letter, perhaps you will let them let them live there after I die as well. So yeah, so he writes to him, and as I say, it's all very deferential. And yeah, so he obviously wants to have this. And actually, this thing about rocky land comes up in another letter. So in another. I'm
sorry,
letter,
where was this? Where was it specifically?
Oh, he doesn't mention which one it was. It was a pen in Jamaica, but I couldn't work out which pen of Rose Fuller's it was. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I couldn't work out which one precisely.
There's a lot of rocky land in Jamaica.
Yeah, I know, sorry. So, but the reason I mentioned that is because in another letter, there's a will in which somebody, I can't remember his name now. Sorry, it's late and brain fog. Anyway, and he leaves, he makes quite a strong piece in it about an enslaved man called Providence, right? And in the same letter, he also gives away various enslaved women who are unnamed to his daughters. So in this part, they're all interchangeable, just any of them you can have. But he mentions this guy Providence, who he doesn't say why, but clearly he was a key enslaved man in some way, or perhaps well known to him, or in some way valued above the rest. And he writes to him that, if he still behaved himself in 10 years' time, he can build himself a house on the rocky land, on my land, which is on a plantation, and also he can have an extra barrel of herrings. Now, apart from, perhaps Jamaica being expensive, he'd have just been grateful to have yet even more herrings, given how expensive food was. But I did wonder if it was just another reminder of, well, this is what my life was. But he's not allowed to leave when he's given his manumission. So he's freed, but he's not allowed. Sorry, I should have said that. He's freed, but not allowed to leave. If he wants to build the house, it has to still be on the land. And also, it's 10 years later. So, who have the enslavers, legatees, executors, etc., are going to remember this thing? And what are they going to think constitutes Providence being well behaved? So this thing is just it's all so insecure. And I've got other stories about that as well, but someone else has raised their hand. But
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sheryllynne. That's great.
Poor
Thank
devils
you.
hardly ever get their freedom in the way they're supposed to. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. David Goering.
Yes, a question for Sheryllynne about just archival stories. It sounds like you've done such a wonderful job of rescuing, as you say, ordinary people from the obscurity of centuries past. And I understand that it's really one main satchel that call it one satchel now from HCA. But I'm wondering about maybe things that you found in other archives to corroborate, or maybe more generally, like what was maybe the story or the moment that really stuck out to you? Something that made you laugh, something that made you think like, wow, this is a genuinely great day in the archive, even if you were looking at photographs from the archive. As we've all been going through pretty tough times in the last several years, we oftentimes look to those fun moments in the archive to keep us going. What was an example of a funny story, maybe from what you were able to read?
Yeah. One of my favourite ones was about a Bristol ship's captain. So, and I did have one of those moments when I stood up and realised I shouldn't shout in the National Archives. I was up in the map room, and I was like, oh my God, why isn't everyone as excited? Oh my God, even the people in the when I took it back weren't interested either, but never mind. But yeah, so I was reading these letters, and what's quite interesting about them is most of them, of course, are just one letter from one person. Occasionally there's two letters from the same person. Very occasionally, different letters mention the same person. So you build up a story about someone. So there's this one ship's captain who someone writes about him, and I'll tell you his name at the end because that's why I like it. So someone writes about him complaining that he wouldn't let him put goods on board. And he said, oh, you promised me the preference, but actually he did somebody else, blah, blah, blah. So now I can't send you home bills of exchange. Actually, I don't think he could get hold of bills of exchange, and that was the real problem. But anyway, then someone else, the sort of the main factor there, who is looking after the goods that this ship's captain has bought there, is saying, writing home saying, oh, he's like a really great guy, he's doing a really good job, and he's had difficulties because And he mentions it, and so does the captain back home to his principal back in Bristol, that loads of his men have jumped overboard to go privateering because they can earn, you know, nearly a year's money in a way. And he said, oh, I don't know if these new people, I've hired them, I don't know if they're going to turn up. So he, you know, and then what's also lovely is that this captain also writes home to his wife, and he's managed to get hold of a bill of exchange, and he says, don't tell the principal, I want you to have this money, I'm going to give it to you first, I know you're struggling. So again, we see all these beautiful stories. But the thing I love is, here's this guy who's had just about every problem go wrong, right? And his name is William Clutson, and I just loved it. I love this guy, and also because he was so, and this is when my old students really used to have problems with me, because, you know, as you were mentioning, Steve, maybe it's my failing that you asked this question right at the beginning, but you sort of get to like these people, even though you know they're, you know, in this working within this horrible society. Now, he's not a slave trader, but he's still providing goods for a slave society, right? He's going there, he's making money out of all this trading system, you know, but somehow, and I feel like Steve's going to like tell me off, but somehow at the end, when I found his will and read that by the time he writes his will, he's lost his wife, he's lost one eldest daughter, he's got only you know, one daughter, all she's going to get is the cushions his other daughter has made, and his son's just going to get one ring. And you think, oh my God, he did this for 17 years for these same people. He's got no property. He's just got like very, very little. Now, maybe, you know, I don't feel really sorry for him, but it did make me sort of, I suppose, in some way, empathize with him, you know. So, yeah, so if I can tell one of the other standout stories from the other side of the coin, if I'm allowed, Steve, is that right? Yeah. So when I was lucky enough to go to Jamaica to look at the archives there, I looked at the manumission records. And here you have, you know, you have like how much they paid, if they paid anything, and who paid it, who was manumitting, or who was the former enslaver, and who the manumitted person was, and of course their colour, you know, whether they were mixed heritage or black or whatever. And so one I found, it's literally all that information is like 3 lines, right? So you just don't, there's not much to go on. But there's one, and this is the one, and I told my lovely taxi driver all the way home about this story. I said, oh, there's this girl, young woman, whose name is Amelia. And if anyone's seen the book, if I can just be really cheeky, I'm going to, that is a dedication at the front. And it's to, you probably can't see it, but it is to Amelia. And for Amelia and for the millions like her, for whom we do not have names and whose individual stories cannot be told. And hers, of course, as a historian, I can only tell so much because there's only 3 lines, right? But she was freed in 1756, 3 months after the wife of her original enslaver died. But there's a note in there that the husband died in 1742, and Amelia was supposed to have been freed then.
Wow.
Wow, exactly. So, you know, as a historian, you can't put too much in a book, but mine was like, oh my goodness, like, did she know? Did she know? Did he tell her? Yeah, so the other thing I should mention, she's mixed heritage. So 2 things here. The mixed heritage women were thought to be particularly beautiful by white men, so maybe she was original enslavers. His name escapes me, which is quite a good thing because it's all about Amelia. You know, maybe he raped her, or they were in some form of extremely unequal relationship. I don't know. Just as likely, he could have been in an unequal relationship with her mother, given that she was mixed heritage, because we don't know, you know, exactly how light she was. So why did the wife do this? Obviously, she was, you know, was it pure spite, or was she one of these weird women that thought she just could not live without her favorite girl? Who knows? why she did it. But my heart went out to Emilio. I thought, did you know or did you not know? Did he tell you before he died what he was going to do? And would it be better not to know? Can you imagine living 14 years next to this woman who was keeping you there when you were supposed to have been freed and you couldn't do anything about it? So there's one story that's on one side, and then this one was the one that's just stuck with me right since I read her that day. I've just thought about Amelia so much when I've been writing this book, and people like her. That stories are so sad, and there's many more like her as well. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, and I think that's probably a good. I've seen no more questions, so that's probably a good point to finish on. Thank you very much. Thanks for writing the book.
Thank you.
And thanks for talking to us. It's a pretty phenomenal piece of work, and I think it's going to be useful for people to look, in a whole range of things. I mean, immediately I thought from Kate's question about the Irish. I mean, some of those people will, of course, have been thrown off the land in Ireland by the enclosures there, and then end up as kind of, as Nini Rogers put it, the colonized become the colonizers. And so there's a whole range of these sorts of things that could be got out of this book. And so I've read it. I thoroughly recommend it to people. If you've got the, can you give us the code again?
Yeah, it's on. I can't repaste it in, I don't think. It's on that last slide.
Read it out. Something.
Then hold on, let me just go back to my. It is so you have to go to it's direct.orders@marston.co.uk. So it's the English distributor. direct.orders@marston.co.uk, and the discount code is M, it's all capitals, M for mother, Q for Quebec, F for Frankie, 2.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. And I think a virtual round of applause from everybody here. And I'll just, before we finish, I'm just going to share my screen now, which you might be able to see, advertising our next seminar, where Liko Burrows, The Seeds of Solidarity, African-Indian Relations and the 1935 Labour Rebellions in British Guyana. So you'll find it on the website, and you can book now your place, and I hope to see many of you again on the 6th of December. So thanks again very much to Sheryllynne. Thank you all for coming, and see you all next month. Bye-bye.
Thanks ever so much. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
That was great, Sheryllynne. That was really good. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Was it okay?
Yeah. It was absolutely fine. Yeah. It's fine. Lots of interesting things there.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm not sure I answered your question very well. I knew you.
No, you did. No, you did. No, absolutely fine. It was really good.